July 23rd. Some interesting developments this week, Keith. First, I know you weren't the co-founder of TechCrunch. There's some controversy about that, but you were certainly the first investor. And TechCrunch, as so often, is making headlines today. Ned Desmond, who's run the TechCrunch now for 8 or 9 years, announced his retirement. And I know, Keith, you think that in itself is an interesting piece of news, but also speaks to the challenges and opportunities for founders. Ned is a kind of model for how to do things right. So give me your analysis of both Ned Desmond's tenure at TechCrunch and what he should teach us.
Well, you know, Ned's been there 8 years. TechCrunch was founded back in 2005 by Michael Arrington. I was his partner in those days in Archimedes Labs, which I still run. And Mike, I think you got to start with Mike. Mike built a lasting brand. And even though he sold it to AOL in 2010, with a lot of help from Heather Hardy, who ran TechCrunch operationally for 2 or 3 years, he really built a lasting brand, mainly due to its impact on the way people think. And so when AOL bought it, normally, you know, that is the start of the end, especially with AOL. And then when Verizon bought AOL and Yahoo, you thought it really has to be the end. and you know, throughout that whole period from 2010, 11, I can't quite remember when Ned joined. 2012, because he's been there 8 years. You know, normally, like with Yahoo, when they brought in a CEO at that point, that was the end. And you thought, okay, Ned's the guy to close this down. But no, Ned has actually built TechCrunch from strength to strength. It now has 20 million monthly readers.
Almost as many as this podcast, Keith, right?
Almost as many as you and me, Andrew. And
20 million?
You at least 20 million monthly. Its revenues are through the roof. Its reputation has grown globally through the things they've done in Europe, in China, and many other places. Lots and lots of hard work by people like Matthew Panzarino and Mike Butcher in the UK. But Ned has shepherded the whole thing and built a very coherent, consistent editorial team, an events team, and a revenue team. And, you know, now he's moving on. I don't know if there's any story behind the fact that he's moving on, but he is moving on. And I think he deserves to be thought about and remembered, because he did a great job.
Round of applause for Ned. He's always struck me. I mean, this is the obvious observation that he's the anti-Mike. You know, Mike was brilliant but obnoxious and crazy and psychotic, and Ned seems a really normal sort of person. Is that fair? You're an insider. You see how these people operate.
Well, Heather was an anti-Mike in that way. Even I was a bit of an anti-Mike in the beginning. I was kind of his partner and mentor in a way. So Mikes need anti-Mikes.
Right. I don't mean that critically. I mean, there's a need for both. And is that a pattern? Is that an observation that you find in many startups, that the founder has to be an obnoxious genius like Mike, and the person to take it to the next level, a Tim Cook, needs to be someone like Ned Desmond?
Yeah, you know, I went through it myself as a young entrepreneur. I had a shrink session at the request of my VCs in 2000, when we were filed for an IPO at $1.5 billion. The company was Real Names. And the shrink, after 2 weeks analysis, during which I went away when he talked to all my team, I came back and he said, do you want the good news or the bad news? And I said, okay, you decide. He said, well, the bad news is the whole team hates you. And I said, okay, what's the good news? He said, the good news is they love you.
Yeah.
I said, okay, well, what do they hate and what do they love? They love your leadership, your vision, your ability to persuade investors to get behind you. They hate your management. And I hired Mary Burnside as the COO.
I could have told you that. Anyone who's even spent more than 3 minutes with you knows that. So Ned Desmond, what's he doing now? Do you think he's going to stay in the startup world, or is he doing something more civically oriented? I assume he doesn't need to work anymore. He's made some cash.
You never know, because he joined after it was acquired, and he was an employed leader. So that isn't always true, but I'm sure he's fine. His wife, who's a wonderful lady, is very challenged with her sight. Oh. And he is doing a project now that will help people with some very specific issues to do with their eyes to be able to navigate the world better. So he is doing something civic-minded as a pro bono, not-for-profit thing.
So coming back to TechCrunch, I know they have great audience and numbers and all the rest of it, but are they really relevant, Keith, in the startup world? Or are they just kind of cosmetic garbage? I always thought, every time, I mean, I've worked with TechCrunch in the past, and the worst thing about them is that they seem to often just repurpose PR statements and just put a certain kind of gloss on them.
Well, they certainly miss the cutting insight of a Michael Arrington, and the acerbic, I don't care what you think of me, I'm going to tell you what I think of you kind of attitude, which he was very good at, both on the upside and the downside, by the way. I can remember him interviewing the CEO of Yahoo and asking her to answer the question, what is Yahoo? And grilling her on stage. So they're definitely missing that. But Matthew Panzarino is no plan B. He's actually a very, very solid journalist and editor. The bigger question is anything any more relevant to startups? Because that whole media, whether it's TechCrunch or Vox or any of them really, The Verge, Kara Swisher, they've all become professionalized and seeking to monetize. TechCrunch was real. It cared. It didn't really care about making money as much as it cared about telling the story. And that can only last for so long, but that has definitely gone. And insofar as there is anything like that still around, it's things like Hacker News.
Well, I would say actually that what's and it's very ironic. The new TechCrunch are honest VCs like Brett Feld, who are not trying to do any kind of selling and who just simply tell the truth. I know one of your highlights of this week is a piece by Brad, the goal that should not be the new normal. I actually have an interview out with Brad about his new book on my podcast, which we perhaps can link to. But it's always struck me that Brad he's not Mike Arrington. He's not a lunatic, but he is a truth teller. He's not shaping his answer or his conversation to anything that he thinks anyone wants to hear. He simply tells it as he sees it. Is that fair, Keith?
I think that is fair. Brad, to be balanced, Brad has been extremely successful over a long period of time, and no doubt has made a lot of money. And therefore, I'm sure at a personal level is quite relaxed. Although if you read his blog, you sometimes wonder whether he can really achieve that. And so he's got that ability to stand back and think. And this week he wrote a really good piece where he talks about this whole idea of the new normal, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And, a lot of people are falling into the trap of embracing the new normal and saying, get used to it. And what he's saying is, no, the new normal is something that's been given to us by the virus. It indicates possible futures, but those futures have to be built. And so let's seize what is good and let's build on it to create something new. And let's start defining what that new thing is. It echoes a little bit what Mark Andreessen said a few months ago when he talked about we need to start building again.
Yeah, although I would distinguish between Feld and Andreessen. There's something slightly, I always think, slippery about Andreessen. I think Feld is a little bit more genuine.
No, I think that's an impression it's easy to get of Andreessen, but you have to remember, and this is real, Mark was an engineer on the first browser. He was just an engineer. He ended up partnering with, what's his name? Ken Clark, is it?
Yeah, not Ken Clark. Something Clark.
The guy from Silicon Graphics.
Right.
Jim Clark.
Jim Clark, yeah.
And together they built Netscape. And Mark was just an engineer. Imagine the learning curve going from where he was to where he ended up. He is a very genuine, very real, thoughtful guy.
Well, I don't want to talk about Andreessen. He's boring. Let's talk about Feld. Do you think this whole idea of going back to the new normal, is this something that he cites Steve Case in this piece? Is there some sort of consensus amongst certainly progressive VCs that we can't just go back to February 2020, that there are these huge opportunities and challenges now, whether it comes to healthcare or tax reform or challenging inequality or obviously the coronavirus, that we need to move ahead? Is Brad out on his own here, or is this some degree of consensus? I mean, people like David Hornick in Silicon Valley are also politically on the left.
I don't think he's on his own, but I think he's saying something that other people haven't yet said. So my reaction when I read it was to think, which is probably the best reaction, and then to contemplate, what am I doing that could be encapsulated under the heading of build the future. And, I'm fascinated. I put a video from Elad Gil in this week's newsletter. Elad is the #1 top performing angel in Silicon Valley over the last 10 years, by far. And there's an hour-long interview with him. And he talks about the fact that he's fascinated by crypto and blockchain. Now, that's an essentially contrarian point of view in the Valley. I share his point of view, but it is very contrarian. And I think the Valley prospers when it's contrarian, when it seizes on things that everyone else thinks are not real and then makes them real. And I suspect Brad is like that as well. So is there a consensus? Not yet, but I think there will be.
And I think Brad's argument is, in some ways, still mainstream Silicon Valley, that progress can be good for everyone. It can address many of our big socioeconomic problems and at the same time make people like himself pretty rich. So in a sense, perhaps, he's not quite as radical as he sometimes appears.
Yeah, I don't think of Brad as radical at all. I think of him as a very smart, hard-working investor.
And he's really focusing on the local and this whole idea of these centers of innovation, whether it's Boulder. So I think his focus on the local also represents a kind of challenge to Silicon Valley, because he's out there in Boulder, Colorado. He's not sitting in Palo Alto or Mountain View or San Francisco. So in that sense, he's already a challenge. And I think that's the core of his thinking, and particularly in his last book.
I think there's two elements there. One is with his Techstars hat on. What you're saying is exactly right. And the business model of Techstars is hyperlocal, and also to partner with big corporates around outsourced innovation. On the other hand, he's part of Founders Fund. And with that hat on, he's really looking to get into the biggest outcomes, no matter where they are. And he's very global. So I think there's many dimensions to Brad.
And of course, still one of the core ways, or really the only way, that VCs make money is when their investments do an IPO. I know some of your headlines this week focuses on IPOs and uncovering how the economics of IPOs work. Are they a bit of a Wall Street scam, Keith, too?
Well, there's quite a lot of highly controversial conversation around IPOs that's been going on for quite a few weeks, but it came to a head this week. There was an article written, just remind me the author's name.
Felix Salmon.
Felix Salmon, that's right. Felix wrote an article about how Goldman Sachs makes money from IPOs. And he's using some of these IPOs that have gone public and then tripled or gone up significantly immediately on the day of the IPO. And Bill Gurley, who is from Benchmark Capital, has been criticizing banks for the role they play in IPOs for a long time, more or less making the claim that banks are stealing money from companies by underpricing the company. Therefore, the investors buy the shares, the investors make all the money, and the company gets much less than it should really have gotten. And Felix's article kind of underlines that. So what the Valley is doing is discussing alternatives to IPOs in the light of that. And there have been a few. The one is called a direct listing. That's when you go public, but you don't raise money or price the company for investors. And investors have to buy the stock from the market at whatever price the market prices it at. So it takes away the bank's ability to act on behalf of its customers, the investors, and basically steal money from the company. The other approach, which Chamath Palihapitiya is doing.
Good job with the pronunciation.
Yeah, I've been learning that. Is called a SPAC. A SPAC is a special purpose acquisition company. And it's kind of ingenious, but it also steals money from companies. But more importantly, it puts money in Chamath's pocket. And the way that works is this. You set up a company and you give yourself 20% of it, like a founder. You then make that a public vehicle and you persuade investors to put in hundreds of millions of dollars into what you could think of as an empty shell public company. Once you've done that, you've got a public company with hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank. You go and acquire a late stage startup and you take it public by merging with it. Virgin Galactic is the latest example of that happening.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you end up with 20% of a public vehicle with a real company inside of it, which goes up in price. So the argument is it's good for the founders, it's good for the investors, and it's good for the company.
Yeah, but it's very much the new normal of IPO, of VCs getting horribly rich in complicated schemes that no one really understands. So I'm not sure that
it's growing. This week, Ribbit Capital just announced a $600 million SPAC. A venture fund announced a SPAC. So that means they're making a bet on acquiring. Instead of investing in a company, they're going to go and acquire one.
I wonder what Brad Feld would think of that. We'll have to have him on the show to
We must ask him, yeah.
But certainly the more quote-unquote ethical VCs, I think, would be troubled by this, aren't they?
No, I don't think so, because...
Who's the loser here, then? You're saying whenever I hear win-win from Silicon Valley, and particularly from entrepreneurs or investors, my hands go in my pocket and think someone's trying to rip me off, because there's always a big loser in any win-win.
If there is a loser, potentially it's the company, because the company is going to end up with no more than, I think the high end would be 70% of the public vehicle, which is a lot less than if they do an IPO.
What about the broader economy, Keith? Let's say that an Amazon or a Google or an Apple do one of these SPACs. I mean, as you know, I'm not always a great admirer of these companies, but they certainly brought an enormous value, not only to their investors and employers, but to the broader economy. Is there a problem perhaps with SPACs that you won't get in future, the Amazons and Googles and Apples that become from startups and IPOs become trillion-dollar companies?
Sorry, I switched to the wrong person there. I honestly don't think so. I think you should think of it as a mechanism that is, in some ways, the starting point and the end point are quite similar, whether you do an IPO, a direct listing, or a SPAC. The starting point is that you're a private company, and you're going to sell some shares and get cash in the bank and have some public investors at the end. So it's the same. It's just three different mechanisms for achieving a public company with public investors with cash in the bank. And you can argue the toss about, on the margin, which one is the most efficient at valuing properly. And for different reasons, I'd be interested in a SPAC just because it gets rid of the IPO roadshow and having to deal with banks and investors. I'd be interested in a direct listing for the same reasons. On the other hand, if I was growing like crazy, I probably would put up with the bankers and the roadshow because I'm going to get a higher valuation if I can tell my story. So I think you've got to be tactical, not too dogmatic about this.
Yeah, I'm sure we brought up Andreessen earlier. I don't think he was a great fan of Jim Clark's roadshow for the Netscape IPO, which was, of course, the key IPO in terms of shaping contemporary Silicon Valley. And I also assume that, Google, when they did their IPO, or Facebook, they were all hyped of changing the system of doing things differently, but presumably they didn't. They didn't really change the rules, their IPOs, did they?
No, I mean, there were some strange things in all of them. Google had two classes of shares. I think Facebook, it had at least two, one of which was wholly owned by Mark Zuckerberg and gave him complete control over the company.
Surprise, surprise. Well, that hasn't worked out so well, has it?
For him, it's fine.
No, not for the rest of us. Anyway, we don't want to have a Facebook conversation. Finally, Keith, lots of people are certainly pre-IPO. They may even be pre-funding. And you've got some interesting reads this week on knowing about fundraising this year. What are the trends? Is it blockchain? Is it AI? Is it something else? Where's the money going this year?
Well, I think the first thing to say, my wife Jenny has a piece in Crunchbase about European investing, and she makes the point that it's gone down quite a bit. So the first thing is there's less money, as you would expect, going into companies. The second piece is by Beeza Clarkson, and she's talking about money going into funds, especially small and first-time funds. And she's making the point that it's going to become really bad out there. So if you have a chance of closing a fund, do it right now. And then there's quite a bit of specific stuff around different companies raising money, all of which suggests if you have a good idea and a strong team, and it feels as if you're consistent with the new normal, as Brad calls it, raising money is still doable. So if you put all that together, I think there's clouds on the horizon. So more than ever, you need to be a great company with great traction. There's a good story about traction in the newsletter.
Blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's not exactly news.
It's not news, but it's finger on the pulse and taking the temperature. Probably the newest thing is the tweet of the week, which is
right. I wanted to end on the tweet of the week, which is a particularly nasty one. So it's an appropriate ending for this show.
Yeah, the tweet of the week basically said, and it's from an entrepreneur who went through the Y Combinator program, basically, as they say, pissing on the table that we all eat from, saying that Y Combinator has lost its soul. And in a very long series of tweets, maybe 30 tweets, in great detail, pointing out why it's lost its soul. I actually replied disagreeing with him, saying it never had a soul in the first place. It was always a business model, a really good business model that Paul Graham and his wife came up with, that worked for Y Combinator, but it was always, the nearest equivalent for a startup founder is being a chicken in a chicken farm in a cage, expecting to lay eggs whilst the master stands below looking for a golden egg from all these hundreds of chickens. Y Combinator was always Silicon Valley at its worst, not at its best.
Is there no organic equivalent of Y Combinator, Keith?
The Valley as a whole is the organic equivalent. Getting money from angels, from seed funds, having to pitch, having to go through all the stages, from the concept to the proof of concept to the minimum viable product to the first revenue, to product market fit, and to growth. There's no shortcut to that. And what YC tried to do is herd sheep, cattle, chickens, whatever you want, into a single space, looking for the good one. And, seeding that with small amounts of money all around, and 99.9% fail, and then rinse and repeat.
Is that a metaphorical number or a real number?
No, that's real.
So for every 1,000 Y Combinator investments, only one comes through?
Well, there's probably a curve, but
well,
one
you just
really
said 99.9, which means that 999 out of 1,000 fail. Is that right?
Well, I believe that is exactly right. And now I'll go and do the numbers for next week, but we already know that 70 to 80% of seed-funded companies never get to the next round. In general, that's in the whole ecosystem. And that there's a bigger story underlying that, which is seed money, venture money, and growth money. There's now, a valley of death in between them all.
So what does that tell us, Keith? What it says, I think, when we go back to the beginning, is as Levi Strauss figured out in the 19th century, is sell the spades, do a tech crunch, and don't do a startup, cover the startups. Is that fair? Mike had it. Mike understood it better than anyone.
No, I think that's wrong. I mean, my original advice to Mike was don't do TechCrunch because the outcome will be too small for the 5 years effort you're going to need to put in. I still believe that was good advice because Mike is so smart, as he's proven since, that those 5 years put to almost any use would have produced more outcome than TechCrunch produced in terms of money. But what it couldn't have produced is Mike's sense of achievement, which was huge because he really did bust a gut doing that. And so I don't want to take anything away from him.
But there's always going to be stories. And I mean, finally, you compare Y Combinator to a factory farm, but the chickens have never queued up to enter a factory farm. And the chickens are queuing up to get Paul Graham's money. And that's not changing. Everybody a bit of Paul Graham and the credibility that lends itself. So I'm still not convinced of either the factory farm analogy with Paul Graham or the fact that the best thing to do in this world of uncertainty and 99.9 failure is cover the story rather than be the story. As we're doing right now, actually.
Yeah, but if you ask me about myself using those two ways of doing it, my investment in Infarm is going to produce thousands times more outcome than my investment of time in doing this podcast. I do this podcast not for money. I do it to force myself to think every week and then to share what I think with others. The end result of that is that companies like Infarm can discover me and come to me, and that's where I really turn effort into outcome. So it's all connected. I wouldn't choose one or the other. They're all connected, any more than I would chastise Paul Graham. Paul Graham is an amazing entrepreneur who did great things, but as a founder, I wouldn't apply. That's really all I'm saying. I think there's better paths. The chickens do still line up, but by the way, the chickens are depreciating in terms of quality and growing in terms of size. So really, really good prize chickens don't go to YC. Never did, by the way.
I'm going to have my chickens now for lunch, Keith. As always, an honor and a pleasure. And I will see you again in the last Thursday of July, where no doubt there'll be many other stories to cover in That Was the Week.
Thanks, Andrew.